Welcome to the silent guest of Hollybridge Manor, a chilling Miss Marple mystery where secrets whisper through locked doors and justice arrives in the softest, most unexpected footsteps. A peaceful manor, a midnight death, and whispers from the past. Can Miss Marple uncover the truth before it disappears forever? I'm so glad to know where you're listening from. Tell me, how are you today? What are you doing right now as you listen? Relaxing? Working? Or having tea with Miss Marple? On a crisp autumn morning, the mist curled low over the hedgerows of Merry Mead, wrapping the little village in a hush that made even the church bells sound subdued. The postman, red-cheeked and cheerful, whistled his way past the green where a notice board announced Hollybridge Manor to host annual harvest charity tea. It was an event of some renown, part social gathering, part gentle competition of manners and pastries, and this year it promised a rather distinguished guest list. Among those attending was Miss Jane Marple, whose pale blue eyes missed little, even behind the mild smile and the delicate lace of her gloves. She had received her invitation the previous week, penned in the neat, decisive hand of Lady Agnes Trevelyan of Hollybridge Manor, an old acquaintance from her governess days, before life had settled into the placid rhythm of teas, knitting, and crime. The manor itself, perched on a rise overlooking the village, had an air of faded grandeur. The ivy had begun to creep higher up the stone walls, and though the lawns were well kept, the gravel drive had not been re-rolled in some time. Yet, for all its age, Hollybridge had charm. Its drawing-room was wide and bright, filled with chintz and whispers of better days. By 3 o'clock, the guests had arrived: doctors' wives, retired colonels, a local bookseller with a nervous smile, and the vicar's wife in lavender. The talk was light, the laughter carefully measured, but it was when the butler announced the arrival of Mr. Richard Vane that the atmosphere subtly shifted. Richard Vane was not local. A man of perhaps 40, well-dressed and reserved, he carried with him the faint air of one accustomed to command. No one quite knew his connection to Lady Agnes, though it was said he had once been engaged to her late daughter, Eleanor, before the young woman's untimely death 5 years ago. His presence was therefore both unexpected and, to some, unsettling. Miss Marple watched him closely as he crossed the room. There was a stiffness in his movements, as though each step required conscious effort. His eyes, dark and intelligent, lingered not on Lady Agnes but on the portrait above the fireplace. Eleanor, painted in her youth, a wistful smile on her lips. A curious silence rippled through the guests, broken only when Lady Agnes greeted him with formal politeness. "You're most welcome at Hollybridge, Mr. Vane," she said, her voice steady but cool. "It's been far too long." He bowed slightly. "Indeed, Lady Agnes, far too long." The tea began with chatter about gardens and weather, yet Miss Marple noted that more than one guest cast glances toward the pair at the head of the table. The butler, a tall, hollow-cheeked man named Simmons, served scones with meticulous precision, but looked pale and distracted. Once, as he passed near Miss Marple, she heard him mutter under his breath something about the wrong room being locked. She tucked that phrase away quietly in her mind. As the clock struck 4, a sudden draught swept through the drawing-room, though all the windows were shut. Lady Agnes frowned slightly. "Odd," she murmured. "There shouldn't be a draught from the west corridor." The conversation faltered, and a faint sound like the slow creak of a door echoed from somewhere deep in the house. Lady Agnes looked toward the butler. "Simmons, would you?" But Simmons was gone. So was the tray he had been carrying. The next few minutes passed in confusion. Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting needles still in her lap. It was not in her nature to panic. Within 10 minutes, the housemaid appeared, white-faced and trembling. "Beg pardon, my lady," she stammered, "but Mr. Simmons, he's lying in the blue parlour. Dead." A gasp rippled through the guests. The doctor's wife clutched her pearls. Lady Agnes rose slowly, her face drained of all colour. "Dead," she repeated faintly. But how? The maid shook her head helplessly. I don't know, ma'am. There's no mark on him. He's just gone. Miss Marple stood, very calmly, setting aside her knitting. Her soft voice, though quiet, carried through the room. Then, I'm afraid, she said gently, your harvest tea will have to be postponed. It seems we've a most serious matter to attend to. Outside, the church bells tolled the quarter hour, and somewhere in the distance, a crow cried a harsh, lonely sound that seemed to settle over Hollybridge Manor like a shadow. By the time the first whispers spread across the drawing-room, Miss Marple had already followed Lady Agnes and two of the gentlemen to the blue parlour. The room, at the end of a narrow corridor hung with dark oil paintings, smelled faintly of lavender and old polish. Simmons lay beside the hearth, one arm tucked oddly beneath him, as if he had tried to rise before collapsing. His eyes were open, but calm, almost as though sleep had overtaken him mid-duty. There was no trace of injury, no disarray in his uniform, no shattered teacups or signs of struggle, only the eerie stillness that follows when life has quietly departed. Miss Marple stood back, her eyes soft but alert. He looks most peaceful, she murmured, almost too peaceful, for a man who's just died unexpectedly. The local doctor, summoned quickly by one of the guests, bent over the body. After a short examination, he frowned. No visible cause, no bruising, no sign of poison, though I'd wager his heart simply gave out. Lady Agnes clutched the edge of a chair. But Simmons was in good health. He'd been with us 20 years. Never a complaint. Sometimes the heart deceives us, the doctor replied kindly. A sudden failure. It happens. Miss Marple said nothing, but she noticed the overturned tray near the door. A single teacup lay on its side, its contents seeping into the carpet in a faint brown stain. She glanced toward it, only one cup spilled. The others were gone. Back in the drawing-room, the guests were restless, eager to talk yet wary of appearing morbid. The vicar's wife murmured that she'd felt something odd when the draught came. Perhaps an omen. Mrs. Weatherby, the bookseller's wife, whispered that she'd seen Simmons drop the sugar tongs, which surely meant a bad sign. Mr. Vane remained apart, silent, his gaze fixed on the dark window pane. When Lady Agnes returned, pale but composed, the room fell still. The doctor believes it was natural causes, she announced. There will, of course, be an inquiry, but I would ask everyone to remain calm and to please stay the night. The storm is gathering, and the roads will soon be impassable. Miss Marple watched her with quiet understanding. It was true the rain had begun to fall steadily against the tall windows, blurring the gardens outside. Guests exchanged uneasy looks. Staying meant more talk, more speculation. It also meant being trapped together within walls that had just witnessed a death. Later that evening, as lamps flickered and the fire burned low, the house seemed to hum with subdued tension. Miss Marple sat knitting in the drawing-room corner, listening. Conversations floated around her, fragmented, charged. The Colonel complained about the inconvenience. Mrs. Weatherby swore she'd heard footsteps in the corridor near the blue parlour, and young Mr. Latham, the solicitor, quietly mentioned that Simmons had once served as butler at a different estate until something unpleasant had driven him away. A misunderstanding, they said, he muttered, but no one ever explained what sort. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click. Interesting, she said mildly. People rarely change professions for misunderstandings. Unless, of course, the misunderstanding involves money. Mr. Latham glanced at her, startled, but before he could reply, Mr. Vane crossed the room abruptly. Lady Agnes, he said, may I have a word? She hesitated, then nodded, and together they stepped into the hall. Their voices carried faintly through the door, strained, low, edged with bitterness. You should have told me before I came, he said sharply. You had no right. I did what I thought proper, Lady Agnes answered. You would have done the same. Miss Marple did not appear to listen, yet her knitting slowed. When the pair returned, both were pale and stiff. A sense of unease settled over the guests, and Miss Marple thought quietly to herself that something or someone else in Hollybridge Manor was far from peaceful. The butler's death, she knew, was not the end. It was merely the beginning. The storm worsened through the night, drumming steadily against the tall windows of Hollybridge Manor. The house, with its long corridors and echoing chambers, seemed to grow alive with sound, the sigh of wind under doors, the rattle of old pipes, the faint shifting of floorboards as servants moved nervously about. Miss Marple did not retire early as most of the guests did. She lingered in the library under the pretext of reading, though her real interest was in observing the quiet drama of a household unsettled by death. The doctor had left just before dusk, his motor car chugging down the gravel path in the rain, leaving behind a sealed note for the constable to collect in the morning. Lady Agnes had withdrawn to her rooms, pleading fatigue. The remaining guests dispersed uneasily. Yet, Miss Marple noted, not everyone seemed eager for solitude. Richard Vane had stayed in the drawing-room after the others retired, seated in the shadows near the fire, a glass of brandy untouched beside him. His expression was unreadable. But when the butler's name was mentioned, his jaw tightened, ever so slightly. Miss Marple, moving quietly as though to replace a book, saw him slip something from his pocket, a folded letter, slightly crumpled. He read it once more, then tore it carefully into pieces and fed them into the fire. The paper curled, flared, and vanished. A curious action, she thought, for a man who claimed no involvement in the household. When she passed by him moments later, he started as though caught. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said too quickly, forcing a smile. "A gloomy night for all this. You'd think the place haunted." "I dare say," she replied gently. "Some houses are haunted not by ghosts, but by memories that refuse to be quiet." He said nothing to that, and when she looked again, he was staring at the flames with a distant, haunted gaze. By morning, the rain had softened to a mist. The manor felt heavy with fatigue, as if it too had not slept. At breakfast, conversation was subdued. The police were expected before noon, and each guest seemed determined to act as though nothing were amiss, an effort that only made their discomfort more apparent. Lady Agnes appeared late, her manner composed but distant. She offered polite remarks, thanked her guests for their patience, and avoided Richard Vane's eyes altogether. Miss Marple, sitting quietly near the end of the table, noticed something peculiar. One place setting was missing a teaspoon, and the maid, flustered, hurried to replace it. A trivial detail, perhaps, yet Miss Marple's mind rarely dismissed such things. Later, as she rose from the table, she passed the blue parlor and paused. It was locked now, a small brass key gleaming in the door. Odd, she thought. Not because the room was locked, that was sensible, but because she distinctly remembered Simmons carrying that very key on his watch chain the previous day. She turned at the sound of footsteps. Mr. Latham, the young solicitor, approached, holding a folded sheet of paper. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "you seem, if you'll forgive me, more composed than the rest of us. May I ask, do you think this was truly natural?" She smiled faintly. "I think nature rarely behaves as people expect, Mr. Latham. But tell me, what troubles you?" He hesitated. "I found this under the hall table this morning. It looks like a note unfinished." He handed it to her. The paper was torn and damp, but legible enough to read. "I can't keep this any longer. She must know the truth before it's too late." R.V. Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. "R.V.," she murmured. "That could be anyone, of course." Mr. Latham frowned. "You think it's Mr. Vane, don't you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she folded the note carefully and slipped it into her knitting bag. "Best not to leap to conclusions," she said softly. "Truth, like tea, must steep at its own pace." Outside, the constable's motor could be heard approaching through the wet gravel. Miss Marple looked toward the window, her eyes thoughtful. Somewhere in this quiet house, the cause of death and the reason for that letter were connected. And as she well knew, the dead were rarely the only silent ones. Constable Harris arrived shortly before midday, his boots leaving damp prints on the polished floor of Hollybridge's entrance hall. He was a solid, earnest man, with a kind face, though the grandeur of the manor seemed to make him uneasy. Lady Agnes received him in the drawing-room, her poise brittle but unbroken, while the remaining guests gathered in uncertain clusters, whispering behind teacups. Miss Marple, unobtrusive as always, had taken a seat near the window, her knitting once again in hand, her eyes quietly taking in every detail. The constable began his questions with polite formality. He asked about Simmons's health, his habits, his duties, whether he had seemed troubled of late. Lady Agnes answered with care, no, he had not complained. Yes, he had been with the family for years. No, she could think of no reason for distress. When Harris mentioned the missing key to the blue parlor, however, her composure faltered slightly. The key, she repeated. I suppose it must have been found and replaced. I gave no instruction for it to be removed. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. Pardon me, Lady Agnes, but I believe Simmons kept that key on his chain. It would be rather unlike him to misplace it. Perhaps, Constable, someone borrowed it? Her tone was mild, but the question lingered heavily in the air. Mr. Vane, seated across the room, shifted uncomfortably. You don't imagine, he said, a touch sharply, that anyone here would stoop to such. He stopped himself, aware of all eyes upon him. It must have fallen in the confusion. Constable Harris nodded, though he made a small note in his book. Perhaps, he said quietly. Still, it'd be sensible to check. He excused himself to inspect the blue parlor with Lady Agnes's permission, and the guests resumed their hushed conversation. Miss Marple waited until the sound of his boots faded down the corridor before addressing Mr. Vane, her voice so soft that only he could hear. You must find this all rather unpleasant, Mr. Vane, returning to a place so heavy with memory. He looked startled. You know, then, about Eleanor? Only what I've heard whispered. Miss Marple replied, her eyes kind but searching. A tragedy that never truly rests, I think. For a moment, his expression softened. She was everything to me. I came here today because Lady Agnes wrote, asking me to see her privately. She said there was a matter concerning Eleanor's will, though I can't imagine what good it would do now. But this death, good heavens, it's as though the past refuses to stay buried. Miss Marple gave a slow nod. The past has an inconvenient habit of returning just when one believes it finally settled. Before he could respond, Constable Harris reappeared, his brow furrowed. Lady Agnes, may I have a word? He said, his tone cautious. She rose immediately, following him into the hall. The guests pretended not to listen, though the murmuring beyond the door was impossible to ignore. When she returned, her face was ashen. The key, she said faintly. It was found in Simmons's hand, but the door to the blue parlor was locked from the outside. The revelation sent a chill through the room. The colonel muttered something about impossible doors, while Mrs. Weatherby gasped audibly. Harris, re-entering, cleared his throat. It seems someone used another key to lock the door after the poor man was inside. I'll have to ask all guests to remain available for further questioning. There'll be an inquest soon enough. As he spoke, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, where a porcelain shepherdess stood slightly out of place. It had been nearer the edge yesterday, she was sure. She rose, pretending to admire it, and noticed a faint smudge, something that looked like soot along its base. Not from the hearth, but from fingers hastily wiped clean. She returned to her seat quietly, mind turning. Someone had locked Simmons in that room. Someone who had reason to fear what he might reveal. And as the storm clouds thickened again over the village, Miss Marple's needles clicked in patient rhythm. She knew the silence of Hollybridge Manor was beginning to speak. The afternoon wore on beneath a curtain of grey cloud, and the rain resumed its steady fall, blurring the windows of Hollybridge Manor until the gardens beyond seemed to dissolve into shadow. Constable Harris remained in the house, questioning each guest in turn, while Lady Agnes attempted to preserve some semblance of hospitality, though the tea laid out in the drawing-room went almost untouched. Miss Marple, having offered herself as the last to be interviewed, passed the waiting time in quiet observation, her fingers resting idly on her knitting, though her eyes missed nothing. When Harris finally called her name, she entered the study where he sat, surrounded by half-filled pages of notes. He stood at once, his tone respectful. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple, but Lady Agnes tells me you've got a good head for details. Thought perhaps you might have noticed something out of place." She smiled gently. "I dare say we all notice something, Constable, but not everyone knows what it means. Tell me, have you found out whether Simmons had visitors before the tea began?" Harris frowned. "No word of any, though the maid, Mary, did say she saw him carrying a tray toward the west corridor about an hour before the guests arrived. She assumed it was for Lady Agnes." "That would be unusual, I think," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Lady Agnes prefers her tea in the morning room before entertaining. The west corridor, however, leads to the old guest wing. Does it not?" Harris looked surprised. "Aye, it does. Locked up these 10 years or more." "Then perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, "it's worth asking whom he was serving." The constable nodded slowly, a spark of unease crossing his face. "You think someone was hiding there?" "I think," she said softly, "that someone wished not to be seen." They were interrupted by a sudden cry from the hall. The maid, Mary, pale and shaking, stood clutching a folded handkerchief. "It's Miss Eleanor's," she gasped. "I found it in the drawer of Simmons's pantry." Lady Agnes appeared almost instantly, her composure cracking. "That cannot be," she whispered. "That room was cleared after her death. There was nothing left." She reached for the handkerchief with trembling hands. Embroidered in one corner, faint but unmistakable, were the initials E.T. A silence followed that seemed to draw every sound from the house. Harris exchanged a look with Miss Marple. "It's possible Simmons kept it as a keepsake," he said cautiously, "if he'd served the young lady." Lady Agnes shook her head. "He was devoted, yes, but he would never have hidden it. Not Simmons. If he had it, it was for a reason." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the handkerchief. "Perhaps it was left for him," she said quietly. "A message of some kind. People who hide things rarely do so without purpose." That night, after dinner, an uneasy meal during which even the ticking of the clock seemed loud, the guests dispersed early once more. The manor was hushed, save for the restless creak of timbers and the occasional whisper of wind under the eaves. Miss Marple remained awake in her room, her candle burning low, her mind working over the day's events. Simmons serving an unseen person in the west corridor. A locked door. A letter signed R.V. And now a handkerchief belonging to the dead daughter, hidden in the butler's quarters. Each clue alone meant little. Together, they formed the outline of something darker, a pattern of guilt and fear stretching back years. A faint sound reached her, then the quiet click of a door latched down the corridor. She rose, slipped on her shawl, and opened her door a fraction. The hallway lay dim, silvered by moonlight through tall windows. A figure moved stealthily toward the west wing, holding a candle shielded by one hand. Miss Marple waited until they disappeared beyond the bend. Then, without a word, she followed. Miss Marple moved silently through the dim corridor, her slippers making no sound on the worn carpet. The figure ahead of her, slender, cloaked in a dark dressing gown, walked quickly but cautiously, glancing back once as though fearing pursuit. The faint glow of the candle revealed just enough for Miss Marple to recognize the tilt of the head, the quick, nervous movements. It was Lady Agnes herself. The older woman's steps led straight toward the west wing, that portion of the house long abandoned since her daughter's death. Miss Marple paused at the end of the corridor, hidden in shadow, and watched as Lady Agnes produced a key, small, brass, unmistakably the twin to the one found in Simmons's hand. She slipped it into the lock of a faded blue door, hesitated for only a moment, and then disappeared inside. The door clicked shut behind her. For several long seconds, Miss Marple remained still. Then she crept closer, pressing her ear against the panel. The faint scrape of wood, a soft sigh, and the sound of paper being moved reached her through the door. Then, silence. Miss Marple considered whether to enter or retreat. In her experience, people who wander into locked wings at midnight rarely intend harm but often conceal truth. She decided on the former. Turning the handle gently, she discovered the latch unfastened. The door opened with a whisper. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and disuse. The candle Lady Agnes held trembled slightly in her hand as she stood before a dressing table covered with a white cloth. Upon it rested a framed photograph of a young woman, Eleanor Trevelyan, smiling with haunting gentleness. Before the photograph lay a bundle of letters, yellowed and tied with ribbon, and beside them, an opened tin box lined with velvet. Lady Agnes started when she saw Miss Marple in the doorway, her face a mixture of shock and exhaustion. "Miss Marple," she whispered, clutching the candle, "you shouldn't be here." "I might say the same of you, Lady Agnes," Miss Marple replied, kindly, stepping closer, "though I dare say you had good reason." The older woman sank into a nearby chair, the flame flickering between them. "I couldn't sleep," she murmured. "I kept thinking of Simmons. He was loyal, too loyal. I believe he was trying to protect me, even at the end." Her gaze dropped to the letters. "These were Eleanor's. She wrote them the summer before she died. I found them locked away after the funeral, but I never had the heart to read them all." Miss Marple approached the table, careful not to disturb the dust. "And yet tonight you felt compelled to do so?" "Yes," Lady Agnes said faintly. "Because of the handkerchief. I know it must mean something. Simmons must have been keeping something from me, something about that summer." She picked up one of the letters and handed it to Miss Marple. The paper was fragile. The ink faded. The first lines trembled with emotion. "Dearest Mamma, I am afraid of what Richard has done. Please forgive me if I cannot face the shame. He says it is for my own good, but I fear it will destroy us all." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind grew sharp. So Eleanor did not die in an accident, as people believed. Lady Agnes looked up sharply. "I never said that. You didn't need to," Miss Marple said gently. "But I suspect Simmons knew more than anyone realized. Perhaps he kept these letters to protect her memory, or perhaps to hold the truth until it was safe." A sound interrupted them, a faint creak from the hall. The candle quivered. Lady Agnes rose swiftly, her expression taut. "We're not alone," she breathed. Miss Marple turned just as a shadow passed the door, a tall figure moving swiftly away, its footsteps muffled but distinct. Without a word, she moved to follow, but when she reached the corridor, it was empty except for the dying echoes of retreat. The west wing fell silent once more, yet in that silence hung unmistakable weight of revelation. Someone else knew the contents of those letters, and that someone would not rest easy while the truth lingered in Miss Marple's hands. Miss Marple stood in the empty corridor, listening to the fading sound of footsteps, until even the faintest echo vanished into the hush of the sleeping manor. The air was cold, carrying the faint scent of extinguished candles and damp stone. Lady Agnes, still clutching Eleanor's letters to her chest, looked as though she might faint. Miss Marple guided her gently back into the room and closed the door behind them. "Who else has keys to this wing?" she asked softly. "No one," Lady Agnes whispered. "Not since Eleanor's death. The servants were forbidden even to clean here. Simmons alone was allowed in once a year to dust, to see that the place remained untouched." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Then whoever that was, they knew precisely where to go. And perhaps what they were looking for Lady Agnes pressed a trembling hand to her forehead. "Do you think they came for the letters?" "I think they came for what the letters might reveal," Miss Marple replied gently. "Tell me, Lady Agnes, was there ever any scandal attached to your daughter's engagement?" The older woman hesitated. There were whispers. People said Mr. Vane was reckless, perhaps even cruel in his pride, but Eleanor adored him. When she fell from the cliff, he was abroad. He never forgave himself. Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward the table where the candle still burned low. "You're quite certain he was abroad at the time?" "Of course." The coroner confirmed it. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "The coroner, but records and truth are not always the same thing." Before Lady Agnes could respond, the door creaked again this time. It was Constable Harris, his cap in hand, face pale and drawn. "Beg pardon, Lady Agnes," he said awkwardly. "There's been another discovery. We've found something in Simmons's quarters." He held out a small envelope sealed with red wax. Lady Agnes gasped. "That's Eleanor's crest," she whispered. Harris nodded. "It was hidden under a loose board in his room." "Addressed to you, ma'am. Shall I?" Lady Agnes reached for it with shaking fingers, but Miss Marple intervened gently. "Perhaps it would be wiser if you allowed Constable Harris to read it aloud. You may find it easier to hear than to see." Lady Agnes sank into a chair, and Harris, clearing his throat, broke the seal. The handwriting inside was delicate but desperate. "My dear Mamma, if you are reading this, then the truth has come at last. Richard is not the man you think. He has done a terrible thing, and Simmons has promised to protect me until I can find the courage to tell you myself. Do not blame him, for he only obeys my wish. I am leaving tonight, not to die, but to disappear. Pray for me, and for him." The constable's voice faltered. "It's signed Eleanor." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the rain tapping against the window. Lady Agnes stared at the letter, her lips moving silently as though she were praying. "Alive," she whispered. "My Eleanor was alive after that night?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice remained calm. "It would seem so, but if she meant to return, someone made certain she never could." Constable Harris folded the letter carefully. "That explains why Simmons kept things quiet," he said slowly. "If the poor girl really did vanish, maybe he helped her. Maybe he was killed for it." Miss Marple nodded faintly. "Yes, but by whom? Someone who feared her return, someone who knew the truth would destroy them." She looked toward the hallway, where the shadows seemed to deepen. "I think, Constable, we must look not to the servants, but to the guests." At that very moment, a sound broke the stillness, a crash from the far end of the corridor, the sound of glass shattering. Harris drew his lantern and ran toward it. Miss Marple followed swiftly, her eyes sharp. When they reached the main landing, they found a window broken, rain streaming through the gap. On the sill lay a single object, a silver cufflink, engraved with the initials R.V. Miss Marple bent to pick it up, her expression unreadable. "How very curious," she murmured. "When guilt breaks glass, it rarely escapes quietly." The silver cufflink gleamed dully in Miss Marple's palm, the engraved initials catching the faint light of Constable Harris's lantern. Rain spattered through the broken window, marking the carpet with dark spots. Richard Vane stood at the far end of the corridor, his face pale, eyes fixed on the scene before him. When Harris turned, holding up the cufflink, there was no mistaking the tremor in his voice. "This yours, sir?" Vane hesitated for only a second, but in that hesitation lay the weight of guilt. "It appears to be," he said finally, his tone forcedly calm. "Though how it came to rest there, I can't imagine. I must have dropped it earlier." "Unlikely," Miss Marple murmured, examining the window frame. The glass fell outward, not inward. Someone tried to open this from within, perhaps in haste. And the cufflink, well, it seems to have been caught as they did. Vane's composure faltered. "You think I was escaping? That's absurd. Why would I run from a tragedy that has nothing to do with me? Because, Miss Marple said gently, tragedies rarely arrive uninvited. They are born of old wounds and unfinished business. You, Mr. Vane, have been circling both since you returned. Constable Harris cleared his throat. Sir, I'll have to ask you to remain in your room until morning. It's only proper while we sort this. Vane opened his mouth to protest, then stopped. His shoulders sagged. Very well. I've nothing to hide. He turned away, disappearing down the hall. When he was gone, Harris exhaled. You think he's our man? Miss Marple shook her head slowly. I think he's frightened, but not of the law. There's something he fears more deeply. Something that began long before this visit. She turned to the window, peering into the rain-swept darkness outside. That broken glass wasn't about escape. It was desperation, someone searching for something just out of reach. Harris looked puzzled. Searching for what? Ma'am, perhaps, Miss Marple said softly. For Eleanor. The constable frowned but said nothing, and together they returned to the main hall. The manor had fallen into uneasy silence once more. The other guests had gathered near the fire, murmuring nervously as lightning flashed through the tall windows. Lady Agnes sat apart, staring into the flames, the newly discovered letter still clutched in her hand like a lifeline. When Miss Marple entered, the chatter ceased. Every face turned toward her curiosity, fear and hope mingling in equal measure. She spoke quietly, her voice soothing. I believe, Lady Agnes, that your daughter's story is not yet finished, and that poor Simmons lost his life because someone wished to keep it that way. The colonel snorted. And you mean to say this has something to do with that fellow Vane? Perhaps, Miss Marple replied. But guilt wears many faces, Colonel. And fear, well, fear has a way of traveling from one heart to another until it finds the weakest. Before anyone could respond, the butler's bell rang sharply from the servants' passage, a shrill, unnatural sound in the quiet room. Everyone froze. Harris was the first to move, his boots echoing as he hurried toward the sound, Miss Marple close behind. They reached the narrow service corridor, where a single lamp flickered. The door to the pantry stood open. Inside lay another figure, Mary. The maid collapsed beside the table. She was breathing, but only barely, her hand clutching a small silver locket. Harris knelt beside her. Fainted, poor thing, he murmured. What's this she's holding? Miss Marple took the locket and opened it carefully. Inside, beneath a cracked pane of glass, was a tiny portrait, Eleanor Trevelyan, unmistakably, and opposite it, a lock of dark hair. But what chilled her was not the likeness, nor the sentimental keepsake. It was the inscription inside the lid, faint yet visible under the tarnish. To E, with all I am, R.V. Miss Marple's voice when she spoke was barely above a whisper. So Eleanor did not fear Richard for herself. She feared what he had done for love. Lady Agnes appeared suddenly in the doorway, white as linen, her eyes fixed on the locket. That was her locket, she whispered. It vanished the night she died. Miss Marple closed it gently. Then it seems it has finally returned along with the truth it carries. Outside, thunder rolled across the moors like a distant drum. The walls of Hollybridge seemed to hold their breath, and Miss Marple knew the storm inside the house was only beginning. Mary was carried to the sitting room and laid gently upon the chaise, her breathing shallow but steady. Lady Agnes hovered anxiously, her fingers trembling as she dabbed the girl's forehead with a damp cloth. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat nearby, her expression calm though her mind was whirring with quiet precision. Constable Harris stood by the hearth, clutching his notebook, his usual confidence slipping under the weight of uncertainty. She'll come round soon, Miss Marple said softly, her tone reassuring. Shock and fear are poor companions for a young girl. Let her rest. Then, lowering her voice, she added, but I would very much like to know why she was in Simmons's pantry at this hour, and how she came upon that locket. Lady Agnes's voice wavered. It must have been hidden there all this time. Perhaps Simmons meant to return it to me, but, Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, my dear, that locket was not hidden. It was planted. Someone wanted it to be found, wanted us to see the inscription. Constable Harris looked startled. You mean the killer put it there? But why draw attention? To divert it, Miss Marple said quietly. A guilty conscience seeks confusion, not silence. Whoever placed that locket wished us to look one way while they moved another. Just then, Mary stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, and she gave a soft cry as her gaze fixed on Lady Agnes. I didn't mean to frighten anyone, she whispered. I only wanted to see what he'd hidden. Simmons told me once, he said if anything ever happened to him, I was to look in the drawer by the pantry door. Miss Marple leaned closer. And what did you find there, my dear? Mary swallowed. A small paper packet. But it's gone now. When I came back to fetch it, the drawer was empty. Only the locket was left. Gone? Harris repeated. Are you sure? She nodded weakly. Someone must have taken it before I got there. I saw a light down the corridor, thought it was you, Constable, but then everything went black. Miss Marple glanced toward the door, her eyes narrowing slightly. A light, you say? Tell me, was it steady or flickering? Flickering, Mary murmured. Like a candle. Miss Marple sat back, her mind connecting pieces that had hung loose before. Not a lantern, then, and candles are seldom carried by policemen. She looked meaningfully at Lady Agnes, whose face drained of colour. Your guests, where are they now? In their rooms, I believe, Lady Agnes said faintly, though I asked the staff to ensure no one wandered about. Then perhaps, Miss Marple said, rising with calm determination, it would be wise to confirm that. Constable, Harris followed as she moved swiftly through the corridors, the hush of the house broken only by the steady patter of rain outside. When they reached Richard Vane's room, they found the door ajar and the bed unslept in. A single candle still burned beside the window, its wax pooled over the holder. On the writing desk lay a half-written note. Harris picked it up, frowning as he read aloud. To whomever finds this, there are things I cannot undo, and truths I cannot bear. If I am gone, it is better so. He looked up sharply. Gone? You don't suppose? Miss Marple interrupted softly. No. Not gone yet. He's still in the house. A man on the edge rarely leaves the scene of his ruin. He lingers, waiting to see if his sin will follow. A sudden sound confirmed her words, a faint clatter from downstairs, like metal striking stone. Without hesitation, they descended to the lower hall. The drawing-room door stood open, light spilling out. Inside, Richard Vane knelt before the fireplace, his face pale, a poker clenched in one shaking hand. On the rug lay a bundle of charred paper, the remnants of the letters from Eleanor's drawer. He looked up, his voice breaking. I thought if I burned them, it might end. But she won't let me go. She never did. Miss Marple stepped closer, her tone quiet but unwavering. Mr. Vane, the dead never bind us, only our own guilt does that. But you cannot cleanse it with ashes. He stared at her for a long moment, eyes hollow, before the poker slipped from his grasp and clattered to the hearth. You don't understand, he whispered. It wasn't me who killed her. It was Simmons who kept her secret, and someone else who made sure she never came back. Miss Marple's eyes, calm as glass, flickered toward the doorway where Lady Agnes stood, her face pale and unreadable. Lady Agnes stood motionless in the doorway, the flickering fire casting her shadow long across the floor. Her eyes, wide and haunted, fixed upon the man kneeling before the hearth. The rain outside beat against the windows like a soft, relentless drum. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, in a voice, scarcely more than a whisper, she said, Richard, what are you saying? Vane rose unsteadily, his face drawn and pale. I loved her, Agnes, he said hoarsely, more than anything. But she discovered something she was never meant to see. Simmons knew too. He tried to protect her, to keep her hidden after she ran. I thought he'd betrayed me. I came here tonight to beg your forgiveness. Not to. His voice faltered, collapsing under its own weight. Miss Marple watched him with steady compassion, though her eyes were as sharp as ever. You didn't kill Simmons, she said softly. But you know who did. Vane's hands trembled. I'm not certain, he murmured, but I feared it. When I saw him alive at tea, I knew he must still have the letters. And when I found the blue parlour locked, Lady Agnes took a sudden step forward. You went to the parlour? Yes, he confessed. I followed him there. I meant only to speak, to make certain he had destroyed what Eleanor wrote. But when I reached the door, it was already locked. I heard a sound, then silence. When I returned later, he was dead. Constable Harris rubbed his jaw uneasily. You expect us to believe you just walked away? I had no choice, Vane cried. I knew how it would look. Agnes, you must believe me. I didn't harm him. Miss Marple glanced toward Lady Agnes, who had sunk into a chair, her expression distant, almost numb. Lady Agnes, she said gently, your daughter's death was declared an accident. Yet from these letters, it seems she intended to start anew. She feared for her reputation, perhaps even her life. Tell me, did you know she planned to leave? The older woman's eyes filled slowly with tears. No, she whispered. She said nothing, but I knew she was unhappy. After the engagement ended, she became withdrawn. I thought time and faith would heal her. I was wrong. She pressed a trembling hand to her lips. If only she'd trusted me. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Sometimes, when love turns to fear, silence becomes the only refuge. She turned back to Vane. You said Simmons was trying to protect her. But from whom? Vane hesitated, then looked toward the door as though expecting someone to appear. From the truth, he said quietly. Eleanor was with child. Simmons knew, and so did one other person in this house, someone who couldn't allow the Trevelyan name to be shamed. Lady Agnes gave a strangled cry. That's a lie. Miss Marple didn't move. Is it? She asked softly. Because the way I see it, only one person had both the means and the opportunity to lock that door after Simmons fell, and only one had reason enough to silence him. The room went very still. The clock on the mantel ticked once, twice. Then Lady Agnes's hands dropped from her face, her voice breaking. He came to me that afternoon, she whispered. Simmons. He said there were papers, letters, proof that Eleanor was alive when she left here. He wanted me to tell the truth, to let her be found. But I couldn't. The scandal would have destroyed everything. My husband's name, our family's standing, everything we built. Vane stared at her in disbelief. You, Agnes. Her eyes met his, filled with exhaustion rather than defiance. I only meant to stop him from speaking. I never meant for him to die. I locked the door to keep him there until I could think. But when I returned, her voice broke entirely. He was already gone. Miss Marple stepped forward, her tone gentle but unyielding. It was not malice, Lady Agnes, only fear. But fear, once awakened, takes more than a life, it consumes all around it. You tried to silence the past. But the past, my dear, has a way of knocking until it's heard. Lady Agnes covered her face and began to weep, the storm outside echoing her grief. Vane turned away, his shoulders bowed, while Constable Harris stood silently, hat in hand, as though reluctant to disturb the tragedy that had finally unfolded. Miss Marple looked toward the dying fire, her voice calm and low. There is mercy in truth, even when it comes too late. Simmons understood that. Perhaps, in the end, Lady Agnes will too. Outside, the first light of dawn crept through the rain-clouded sky. The storm had passed, leaving Hollybridge Manor quiet once more, its secrets, at last, laid bare. The dawn crept across the moors like a weary sigh, brushing pale light against the drenched stones of Hollybridge Manor. Inside, the air was heavy, as though the house itself mourned the secrets that had finally been spoken. Constable Harris had taken Lady Agnes's quiet confession without handcuffs or formality. She had surrendered to it with a strange calm, her tears having already run their course. Now she sat in the morning room, the rain clouds thinning beyond the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap as if awaiting judgment. Miss Marple stood nearby, gazing out at the sodden lawns. The storm had left behind a glistening silence. Every leaf, every cobblestone gleamed with the uneasy clarity that follows ruin. Richard Vane stood near the fireplace, dishevelled, eyes hollow. He had not spoken since Lady Agnes's confession. Guilt had drained him, though it was not for murder, but for everything that had led to it, the pride, the shame, the silence. When Constable Harris re-entered the room, he looked awkward, as though burdened by the weight of decency. "The magistrate will be informed," he said softly, "but I think the inquest will find compassion. It was an accident, after all." Lady Agnes gave a faint, tired smile. "An accident of conscience, perhaps. Those are the worst kind." Miss Marple turned from the window. "I think, my dear Lady Agnes, that Simmons himself would forgive you. He died for loyalty, misguided though it may have been. And you acted from fear, a common weakness, though it leads so often to uncommon tragedy." The older woman's eyes glistened. "You speak as though you've known it yourself, Miss Marple." A small, rueful smile curved Miss Marple's lips. "One learns, over time, that evil rarely arrives dressed for the part. It comes softly, in whispers and decisions too small to notice until they grow monstrous." The constable cleared his throat. "We'll need to arrange for Mr. Vane to give a full account as well. The letters, the engagement, his part in this." Vane looked up sharply. "My part," his voice cracked, raw with exhaustion. "My part was love, and it destroyed everything. She wanted to go, you see. Eleanor wanted to leave before anyone discovered the child. I told her we could run away together. But she vanished before I could find her. For years I believed she had thrown herself from the cliff. I lived with that guilt every day." He pressed his hands to his face. "If I'd gone sooner, if I'd faced the shame, perhaps none of this." Miss Marple interrupted gently. "You mistake yourself, Mr. Vane. Guilt is never cured by self-punishment. You were cruel. Yes, careless, perhaps, but you were not the only one who failed her. Everyone did, in their way. Even Simmons, by keeping her secret when truth might have saved her." Lady Agnes spoke suddenly, her voice trembling but clear. "Do you mean to say she lived beyond that night?" Miss Marple turned to her slowly. "I think she might have. The letters suggest she intended to leave quietly and begin anew. And the absence of a body, the lack of real proof, it all points to one thing. Eleanor's end may not have been in the sea, but in the silence of those who benefited from her disappearance." A shadow crossed Lady Agnes's face. "Then you believe someone else found her?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly. "A frightened young woman, alone, carrying scandal, might have turned to those she thought she could trust. But the world can be unkind to desperation. I suspect she died not long after leaving here alone, perhaps ill, perhaps betrayed. And Simmons carried that knowledge all these years." Vane's voice broke the hush. "Then he protected me?" "No," Miss Marple said, her tone firm. "He protected Eleanor's memory from everyone, including you." Harris looked uneasy. "It's a sad tale, ma'am, but I can't help wonder why now. Why bring the letters forward after so long?" Miss Marple gave a faint sigh. "Because guilt ripens like fruit. Sooner or later, it falls. Simmons knew his time was nearing its end. Perhaps he wished to free Lady Agnes of her burden, or perhaps he feared someone else might use the truth against her. The hand that locked that door wasn't born of hatred, Constable. It was born of desperation, and desperation is a crueler master than malice." Lady Agnes whispered, "I only wanted to protect her name." "And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "by protecting her name, you erased her life." The words lingered in the air like a benediction and a curse. Later that afternoon, as the authorities departed and the manor fell once more into uneasy quiet, Miss Marple lingered in the blue parlour. The faint scent of lavender polish clung to the room. The fire had long gone cold, and only the rustle of the wind stirred the curtains. On the mantel, the portrait of Eleanor seemed to watch her, serene and distant. Miss Marple studied the photograph for a long time. "You see, my dear," she murmured softly, "the truth always finds its way home, no matter how tightly one locks the door." She reached out and straightened the frame ever so slightly. Outside, the clouds began to lift, revealing a thin thread of sunlight across the wet grass. The village bell tolled noon. Soon the servants would begin tidying what was left of the chaos. The guests would leave, their gossip softening into rumour by the time it reached Mary Mead. And Miss Marple, ever mild and observant, would take her tea at 3 o'clock as usual, knitting in hand, thinking not of justice nor punishment, but of the quiet frailty of human hearts. For in every tidy village and gracious home, she knew, there lay some hidden room, a place where secrets slept until someone, quite by accident or conscience, turned the key. And that was always when Miss Marple found her work waiting. She closed the door gently behind her, leaving the blue parlour in silence. Only the faintest glimmer of light touched Eleanor's portrait, as though the dawn itself had chosen to forgive. The following morning, Hollybridge Manor was wrapped in a strange stillness, not the eerie kind that had haunted its halls the previous night, but a heavier, more sorrowful calm, the sort that settles over a house after something unspoken has finally been named. It was not peace, not yet, but the first fragile breath in its direction. Miss Marple took her breakfast alone in the corner of the morning room, a modest plate of toast and poached egg laid neatly before her. The rain had stopped at last, and the pale October sun, veiled by ribbons of lingering mist, spilled faint light through the high windows. Outside, the lawns were slick and glistening, and a robin hopped uncertainly along the gravel path, as if unsure whether it, too, belonged here after all that had transpired. Lady Agnes had not come down. The staff, moving quietly through their routines, offered no commentary on the matter. They were used to enduring things in silence. Richard Vane, Miss Marple was told, had left before breakfast. The note he left for Lady Agnes was sealed and private. But there was a look in the housekeeper's eye, a faint glimmer of relief, or perhaps pity, that suggested it contained no recriminations, only the soft weight of regret. Miss Marple finished her tea and stepped into the hall, just as Constable Harris arrived with the magistrate's man, a tall fellow with a pinched expression and ink-stained fingers. They exchanged brief greetings, and then she excused herself for a walk around the grounds. The day, she said with her usual serenity, was far too lovely to waste. And so she strolled along the damp stone path, past the old rose garden and the east-facing hedge that had once formed the backdrop for Hollybridge's summer fetes. The hedges were wild now, the flowers gone. Here and there a few stubborn rose hips clung to bare branches like drops of blood in the frost. Miss Marple paused to admire them, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She had no doubt the official report would be written carefully. Lady Agnes would not be tried. The inquiry would frame Simmons's death as an unfortunate accident, brought on by stress or sudden collapse. There would be polite omissions in the final report, the letters, the locket, Eleanor's broken engagement, carefully filed under private matters. And perhaps that was as it should be. Public justice, Miss Marple knew, was not always the same as moral justice. The law dealt in facts. Truth, however, was far more elusive and far more enduring. She walked on, and as she approached the little chapel ruin at the edge of the property long unused, its stone walls crumbling under ivy, she saw someone standing within its shallow archway. Mary, the maid. She was not crying, but her hands were folded before her as if in prayer, and her eyes were fixed on the tiny altar stone where the morning light lay across moss and cracked marble. Miss Marple did not startle her. She moved quietly to her side and stood with her for a moment before speaking. You knew Eleanor better than anyone else here, didn't you? Mary turned her head slightly. I was only a maid, ma'am. You were a friend, Miss Marple replied. And friends often know what even mothers don't. Mary gave a faint nod. She wasn't perfect, you know. Eleanor. She was spoiled, sometimes cruel without meaning to be. But she was kind to me. She used to sit right here, where you're standing, said it was the only place she could breathe when the house felt too small. Miss Marple looked at the cracked altar. Did she tell you she was going to leave? I helped her pack, Mary said softly. She gave me her locket. Said she couldn't keep it, not where she was going. She said if anything happened, I should give it to her mother. But I was afraid. After they found her shawl by the cliff, everyone assumed the worst. Lady Agnes. She shut the wing down. And I didn't know what to do. So you hid the locket, and Simmons found it. He never said a word, Mary whispered. But the day before he died, he told me the past never stays buried forever. That some truths wake up when they're needed most. Miss Marple nodded. He was right. They stood in silence for another moment. The wind lifted, carrying with it the faint, earthy scent of fallen leaves and wet stone. Then Mary turned toward her. Do you think she really died that night, Eleanor? I think, Miss Marple said slowly, that whatever hope remained of her survival vanished the moment her absence became convenient. Someone helped her disappear. Yes, but the world beyond these gates was not made for frightened, pregnant girls with no name and no fortune. She may have lasted days or weeks, but she did not return because she could not, and the knowledge of that is what finally broke Simmons. Mary wiped her sleeve against her cheek. She deserved better. They always do, Miss Marple said quietly. But sometimes, even knowing the truth is a kind of justice. The dead deserve to be named, not forgotten, and you helped give her that. As they turned back toward the manor, a soft cry came from one of the trees near the edge of the garden. A blackbird, startled from its perch, rose into the air and vanished into the morning sky. Later that day, as Miss Marple prepared to leave, Lady Agnes appeared at the door. She was pale, dressed in black, her eyes older than they had been just days before. But there was no hostility in her voice, only humility. I suppose I owe you thanks, Miss Marple, and an apology. No apology necessary, Miss Marple replied kindly. I only followed where the truth led me. I don't know what I'll say to the village, Lady Agnes murmured. Say that your heart was broken once, Miss Marple said, and it took time to understand how deeply. That's something they'll understand better than you think. Lady Agnes reached out and took her hand. Will you visit again? Miss Marple smiled gently. Perhaps, but let us hope there's no murder next time. As her cab pulled away down the long gravel drive, Miss Marple glanced back at the house. The windows were shuttered now. The ivy still crept along the stone, but something had shifted. Not a happy ending, no, but a necessary one. In Hollybridge Manor, the silence had finally been broken.